Welcome back to 1834, chess friends. It's match number 2, game number 5. McDonnell is winning 3 games to 1. I wonder if he can increase his lead, or will Labourdonnais come up with something? It's the best of 9 in this match, and that means McDonnell's only 2 games away from winning. Let's see if he can do it. e4, e5, and bishop to c4, knight to f6, and now d4 from McDonnell. And Morphy up there in 1859 comments. He says, knight to f3 is now generally preferred at this point and leads to an interesting game. Black's reply is capturing the pawn with the knight or knight to c6. If the former be adopted, capturing the pawn, knight to c3 on white's pawn, a move first brought in vogue by Mr. Bourdonnais, undoubtedly the strongest English player of the present, affords a scope for positions of peculiar interest. But should black decline the capture of the king's pawn and moves knight to c6, the opening is resolved into the two knights game, white's rejoinder being knight to g5, or perhaps better, d4. Okay, thank you, Morphy. Very interesting. So we have d4 from McDonnell. E captures d4, and now instead of capturing back with the queen, McDonnell just pushes his pawn to e5 and threatens the knight. So to deal with this, Labourdonnais plays his queen to e7, and now the pawn, of course, can't take the knight here because the king would be in check. But Morphy comments, he says, queen to e7, a bad move, resulting in loss of time and position. d4, black's accepted play would have given him the better opening. Okay, Morphy, that's not what happened. We have queen to e7, and now McDonnell plays queen to e2, and now the knight is in danger. So here, Labourdonnais plays it back to its starting position. And Morphy comments again. He says, this move is compulsory. Had black now played d5, he would have evidently have lost a piece, as white would have captured the knight with the pawn, and on black's exchanging queens, his best move, he would have retaken with the bishop, and now he's up a whole piece. Okay, interesting, Morphy, thank you for that one. So the knight went back to its home square. We now have knight to f3 from McDonnell, knight to c6 developing and adding a little bit of pressure to the centre pawn, c3 from McDonnell and d6 from Labourdonnais, and now McDonnell captures the pawn on d4, and here Labourdonnais says, I'm going to pin your knight, if you move it I'll capture your queen, and McDonnell says, well, I'm going to pin your knight, and if you move it, well, you lose the game because that would be illegal. And they continue with d5, and we have knight to c3 developing his other knight, queen to e6, and McDonnell pushes his h-pawn, saying, what do you want to do with this bishop? Do you want to capture my knight, or do you want to run away? So Labourdonnais captures the knight, the queen captures back, and here the engine suggests that knight on g to e7 would be a fine move, but Labourdonnais instead castles queenside. So McDonnell immediately captures this knight, and the queen captures back, but Morphy is not very happy with this. He's very critical, and almost as if Labourdonnais can hear Morphy in the future, he starts to sweat beneath his comb-over. So Morphy says, surely capturing back with the pawn would have been far better. The uncovering of his king was a matter of small consequence compared to the loss of his valuable f-pawn and the passing of his adversary's advanced centre pawn. So yeah, Morphy not very happy with that. It's correct that Labourdonnais starts to sweat. So as Morphy said, the queen captures the f-pawn, and now Labourdonnais develops his dark square bishop and pins the knight here. So McDonnell reacts by advancing, developing his bishop and interposing it between the knight and the king. Knight to e7, and the queen can't capture it because, of course, the bishop can go backwards, it's still defending it. We have castles from McDonnell and rook on d to f8, threatening the queen, so McDonnell retreats it to h5, and Labourdonnais brings his knight forwards to f5. Remember that McDonnell still has this passed pawn here, so this could be very interesting. It's something for Labourdonnais to watch out for. We now have a3. McDonnell's had enough of this bishop. He's again asked, are you going to retreat or are you going to capture? And again, he captures, and this time the bishop captures back. And Labourdonnais had enough of the queen being here, so he pushes his pawn, g6, and the queen goes back to d1. We now have h5, so pushing some more pawns on the king's side. Maybe he's trying to make something against the king here. We have rook to c1, x-raying the queen, and the queen goes back to the e6 square. Now, queen to e1, backing up the central pawn, and h4, so Labourdonnais keeps pushing his pawns. We have f4 from McDonnell. Now he's trying to make some sort of spearhead out of his central pawns here. Maybe he can get one of them across. We have rook on f to g8, so he's trying to get through this line here directly to the king. And we have rook to f3. King to b8 now, trying to tuck himself away out of danger. And queen to d2, and rook to h7, and now queen to d3. McDonnell getting his queen onto the light square diagonals, where previously he was a little bit weak. You can see most of his pawns and the bishop are on the dark squares. And here Bourdonnais plays rook to g7, so he's doubling up along the g file and hoping to push this pawn forwards and make something out of this. So McDonnell deals with it by bringing his bishop to d2, and Morphy says, preventing the threatened advance of the g-pawn. So if the g-pawn was pushed here, the pawn could capture. Now if the rook captures it, he's going to be losing the exchange. You can see that Bourdonnais has a knight for a rook, so he's not going to want to do that in a hurry. So let's go back. Bourdonnais plays a6, we have b4, and now queen to b6, and McDonnell plays bishop to c1. Morphy doesn't like this at all. He says, this bishop was well posted and should not have been withdrawn from the diagonal it occupied. Rook to c5, as suggested by Mr. Walker, would have done white better service. Okay, and Bourdonnais senses Morphy's discontentment and he stops sweating so much. We have now knight to g3, so infiltrating into the position a little bit here, and we have a4, and now knight to e4 on this nice central outpost. b5, g5, and Morphy says, black now gains an opening on the adverse king. But his attack fails and the strength of white's past centre pawns becomes irresistible. Okay, very interesting. So Bourdonnais is starting to sweat again. We have f5 from McDonnell. So now he's got two connected passed pawns here, very strong. We have g4 from Bourdonnais continuing to go on the attack. H-pawn captures, the rook captures the pawn, and now rook to c2, adding a second defender to the pawn along with the king, and there's only two rook attackers here, so McDonnell should be fine for now. But look out for this very strong knight. It's watching the g3 square, which could come in very useful for Bourdonnais. He pushes h3, and Morphy says, Bourdonnais' management of the latter part of this game is very ingenious, but the crushing force of McDonnell's pawns tells heavily throughout the termination. Okay, so here McDonnell captures the pawn, and Bourdonnais advances his rook, so that it's now threatening the queen. McDonnell just captures, but now Bourdonnais brings his other rook to bear, and again threatening the queen. McDonnell doesn't respond to this by moving his queen out of the way. Instead, he pushes his a5 pawn to attack Bourdonnais' queen, and Morphy says, very well played. And here Bourdonnais played queen to h6, and Morphy wants to show us some lines. I'll go through one of them for you. He says, if the rook captures the queen, black would have won a piece but could not have saved the game. Suppose the pawn captures the queen back, the knight captures the bishop, the rook captures the knight, and the rook captures the rook, then McDonnell can queen one of his pawns, for example f6. Now, the rook can't come here because this square is defended by this pawn, and this square is defended by this pawn, so he's not going to be able to catch the f-pawn in time, and McDonnell will get a queen and win. So thank you very much for that, Morphy. Let's go back to the actual moves that were played in the game. We have the queen coming across to h6, as we said, and now bishop to d2, threatening the queen, while his own queen is still under attack from the rook. Bourdonnais brings his queen down to h3. This pawn can't take it because it's pinned by the rook, but this adds another attacker to the pawn with only the king defending, so McDonnell brings his queen down to f1 to add another defender. And Bourdonnais now starts to worry about the passed pawns and brings his rook back while still holding the pin to try to maybe help stop these pawns coming across. We have f6 now from McDonnell. He's starting to really push. We have queen to h5, protecting the f7 square, but it's backed up by the white queen, so he pushes it anyway. We have rook to f8, getting in front of it to block it, and e6 from Bourdonnais. Knight to g3, attacking the queen, but also eyeing up the h1 square for the black queen to come into. McDonnell just moves to f3, offering a queen exchange, which of course Bourdonnais does not accept. He brings his queen to h1, but the king has an escape square on f2, which he goes to. And now the knight goes to e4, which is check again, and it's defended by the central black pawn. So the king moves again to e2. And now he can't capture the pawn here. It's defended by the white queen. So he comes across to b1 and attacks this pawn and the rook simultaneously. But McDonnell just doesn't mind. He's interested in promoting. He pushes his e pawn, and this is looking very dangerous indeed. However, this capture on the pawn comes with a check, and McDonnell just calmly blocks this with his queen. So Labourdonnais checks him again with the knight, and of course the white queen can't pick this up because it's pinned. So what does McDonnell do here? He again calmly plays his king to d1, which looks a bit odd because he's now appears to be hanging his queen, but it's actually all completely fine, and so fine in fact that Labourdonnais resigned the game in this position, and McDonnell went up 4 games to 1 in this second match. He only needs 1 more game to win it. And not only that, Labourdonnais needs to win 4 in a row to come back and win it himself. Awesome stuff from McDonnell, we love it. So why did Labourdonnais resign here? Well, for example, let's go through a few variations. If the queen captures here, then we're going to have the rook getting captured by the pawn with the promotion, which is check. The queen can come back and check again, and well, if he goes to the back rank, he'll promote again, and then it will be mate. If he blocks with the pawn, we'll have check, and then check, and then the king moves to the corner and promote to a rook, so that's cool, and checkmate. Let's go back a little bit. If instead of capturing the queen in this position, he tries more checks, well, he'll block with the rook here, and if he captures the queen again, it'll just be the same result with promotions and then a checkmate. He could try checking again, but he'll just get captured, and then it's even worse. How about defending the queening square? Well, that doesn't work. Not defending the queening square here. It doesn't work because the queen will be exchanged, and then we'll just end up with pawns getting promoted again. So everything just completely winning for McDonnell here. So awesome stuff. Labourdonnais was completely right to resign, of course. And thank you for joining me for this excellent game. And I'll see you again next time. We'll see if McDonnell can actually get over the line and win this second match.